She had nothing, no money, no home, only her daughter in her arms until a wealthy stranger sheltered her. But when betrayal and secrets from both their pasts surface, will love be enough to hold them together? Or will everything fall apart again? The rain had been relentless that evening, a gray sheet pouring over the city as if the sky itself mourned her pain. Grace Winslow stood at the edge of the sidewalk, soaked to the skin, one arm tightly clutching her small daughter, Lucy, while the other held a tattered suitcase. Her hands trembled, not from the cold but from exhaustion and fear. Everything she owned was in that case, and everything she loved was in her arms. They had no place left to go. She glanced down at Lucy, who despite the chill, offered her a sleepy smile. That smile, fragile and unknowing, was the only thing that kept Grace moving. Her daughter didn't deserve this. No child did. Certainly not because her mother had trusted the wrong man. 6 years ago, Grace was a brilliant undergraduate student, studying literature and history. Her future sparkled with promise. That was before her parents were killed in a car accident. The trauma shattered her world. Then came Derek, handsome, charming, and comforting at first. He convinced her that love could heal her wounds. But once Lucy was born, his mask slipped, the verbal abuse turned physical. And the day he struck Lucy's crib in a fit of rage was the day Grace decided to run. They had lived in shelters, spare rooms, and cold stairwells ever since. Grace had tried working, cleaning houses, and waitressing, but without permanent residence, without references. It was impossible to sustain. That evening, drenched and desperate, Grace knocked on the door of the only name left on the list. The shelter manager had given her. Distant cousin of her late mother had once worked as a housekeeper for the Van Breckenridge estate, a wealthy family tucked deep in the wooded edges of the city, with rumors of grand halls and secret tragedies. Grace didn't believe in rumors, but she did believe in the flicker of hope. When the mansion's great doors opened, she was met not with sympathy but suspicion. The man who opened it was not a butler, but Alexander Van Breckenridge himself. Tall, imposing, with a gaze carved from stone, he looked down at her as though she were a ghost. "Yes," he said, voice clipped. Grace straightened her back. "I'm Grace Winslow. My mother was Celeste Moore. She told me she had family who once worked here. I don't know where else to go." Alexander's eyes narrowed, flicking from her wet hair to Lucy's tiny hand gripping her coat. The silence stretched painfully. "Please," Grace whispered. "Just for a night." He stared another moment, then finally stepped aside. "Come in." The inside of the mansion was just as haunting as she'd imagined. Portraits watched her with hollow eyes. The warmth of the fire could not erase the chill she felt. Still, it was shelter. Lucy slept in her arms as Grace dried her hair by the hearth. Alexander stood nearby, arms folded. "You say you're Celeste Moore's daughter?" She used to speak of a Grace. Grace nodded. "She died when I was 20. I have no one else, and the child. My daughter, Lucy." He said nothing for a long while. Finally, he offered her a guest room and a hot meal. "Just for the night," he said. "I don't run a boarding house." But one night turned into two. Two turned into a week. Lucy's quiet charm softened even the stoic Alexander. And Grace's humble dignity began to shift something dormant in the man who had built walls around his heart since his wife's death. 5 years ago, Grace discovered the mansion was more than a fortress, it was a mausoleum of memories. Alexander had buried his heart with his wife, Victoria, a woman whose presence still lingered in rooms kept untouched. And yet, over quiet dinners and late-night talks, Grace's kindness began to stir life back into those empty corners. She read stories to Lucy in the library. She fixed broken locks. She arranged old vases with wildflowers. Alexander watched her quietly. A flicker of something unfamiliar crept into his expression each time she smiled. Then came the night Victoria returned. Not from the dead, of course, but from Europe. She had left to find herself after their estrangement, leaving Alexander alone, to mourn a love that had long faded. When she stepped into the mansion again and saw Grace and Lucy by the fire, the mask of surprise barely covered the venom in her voice. "Who is this?" "A guest," Alexander replied. Victoria studied Grace like one would examine a stain. "And how long will she be your guest?" Grace stood her ground. But her heart pounded. Victoria wasted no time planting seeds of suspicion. She whispered into Alexander's ear, casting doubt on Grace's intentions. "A young woman shows up claiming family, with a child no less, and finds herself nestled into his estate." It was too convenient, though Grace never heard the words. She felt the shift. The warmth in Alexander's eyes turned to uncertainty. He questioned small things. He withdrew, and one day, as Grace played with Lucy beneath the garden's weeping willow, Alexander approached with a coldness that pierced her like frost. "Victoria tells me you have no proof of relation. No documentation." Grace blinked. "My documents were stolen at the last shelter. I never claimed anything more than a night of safety." "Is that truly all you want?" Tears threatened. "I never asked for anything. I never wanted anything but safety for my daughter." Alexander said nothing. And Grace understood. That night, she packed her things. Without drama, without accusation, just quiet resolve. She kissed the dozing Lucy, lifted her into her arms, and left a short note. "Thank you for your kindness. I understand now, Grace." Outside, the night was once again cloaked in rain, but this time, Grace did not tremble. She had her daughter, she had her dignity, and she would find their place in the world, even if the world didn't want her. The days that followed, Grace and Lucy's settling into the Van Breckenridge estate, were peaceful, almost too peaceful for Grace's cautious heart. Every morning, sunlight filtered through the high-vaulted windows, and Lucy's laughter echoed in the halls like a melody Alexander hadn't realized he needed. The mansion, once silent and cold, felt like it had taken a breath of life. And yet, under the warmth of their shared smiles and exchanged glances, Grace felt a quiet anxiety building in her chest, one she couldn't quite name. Alexander had grown fond of their presence. He found himself drawn to Grace's quiet strength, to the way she gently guided Lucy with calm authority, how she folded napkins with care, or the way her eyes lit up when Lucy called out her name. But it wasn't just admiration, it was something deeper. Something he hadn't felt since he was young and still believed love wasn't a risk. One rainy afternoon, while Grace was reading with Lucy in the library, Alexander stood in the doorway, silently. His heart stuttered as he watched the two of them curled up on the plush carpet, surrounded by open picture books and colored markers. Grace hadn't noticed him yet. She looked peaceful, happy, and that image, a woman and child wrapped in their little world, was the most human thing he'd ever seen in his home. He cleared his throat lightly, and Grace looked up, her lips curled into a smile. "Lucy's teaching me how to draw a unicorn," she said, holding up a stick figure horse with stars for eyes and a tail made of pink squiggles. "Is that right?" Alexander replied, walking in, his voice laced with warmth. "I'd say you've got a real future in the arts." Lucy grinned. "I'm the teacher, Mommy's still learning." Grace laughed, the sound lighting up the room. That night, after Lucy had fallen asleep, Alexander invited Grace to share a glass of wine in the solarium. She hesitated at first, unsure whether stepping into more personal territory was wise. But she accepted. They sat beneath the glass ceiling, where rain tapped softly. The stars veiled behind a gray sky. "You've changed this place," Alexander said, after a long pause. Grace turned to him, her expression curious. "What do you mean?" "This house, me. Before you came here, everything was cold. Predictable. Efficient, yes, but sterile. Now it feels like I'm living in it, instead of just existing in it." Grace felt the weight of his sincerity. Her chest tightened, not from fear, but from the realization that Alexander wasn't just being kind. He was opening up. "I'm glad we could bring something good," she replied quietly. "You've brought more than good," he said, looking at her fully. "You've brought life." They didn't speak again for a moment. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was layered with emotions neither could yet name. But just as their connection deepened, shadows began to slither at the edges. Victoria Lennox returned from her business trip 2 days earlier than expected. She entered the estate unannounced, her stilettos clicking on the marble floor, her perfume announcing her presence before her voice did. She hadn't expected the mansion to feel different. She also hadn't expected to hear a child's giggle echoing from the drawing room. She stepped in to find Lucy perched on the edge of the couch, crayons scattered around her, while Grace sat nearby, folding laundry. The sight struck her as wildly out of place. Like seeing a homeless woman sipping champagne in a penthouse. Victoria's lips curled into a tight smile. "And who are you?" Grace stood quickly, startled. "I'm Grace Winslow. Alexander allowed my daughter and me to stay here temporarily." Victoria's eyes flickered with restrained contempt. "Temporarily," she echoed. "How generous of him." Lucy stood up. "Hi, I'm Lucy. I like grapes and unicorns." Victoria didn't respond to the child, but her gaze narrowed slightly as she studied the pair. Later that evening, Alexander returned to find Victoria waiting in his study, a glass of scotch in hand. "You've taken in strays now?" she asked, her tone light, but the edge unmistakable. Alexander frowned. They needed help. It's not up for discussion. Victoria took a slow sip, studying him. You don't let people in, Alex. That's always been your strength. You see things for what they are, not for what they pretend to be. She's not pretending. You sure about that? She asked, setting her glass down. You're a brilliant man, but even brilliant men make mistakes when emotions get involved. Don't let some sad eyes and a sob story blind you. You don't know her. Not really. Victoria's words lingered longer than Alexander liked to admit. He had no evidence, no logic to justify the growing discomfort. But the poison of suspicion had already been planted. That night, Grace noticed a shift in Alexander. He was quiet, withdrawn. During dinner, he barely made eye contact. His mind seemed miles away. Everything all right? She asked gently. Yes. He answered too quickly. Just tired. Long day. Grace nodded, but the chill in his voice didn't go unnoticed. The following days were strained. The warmth that had started to bud between them was now tempered by something unspoken. Alexander still watched Grace and Lucy, but now there was calculation in his eyes. He wasn't watching because he was captivated, he was watching because he was uncertain. Grace felt it like standing in sunlight, only to be covered by a slow-moving shadow, and it hurt more than she cared to admit. Victoria, meanwhile, wasted no time. She privately contacted one of her acquaintances, investigators skilled in unearthing inconvenient truths. She gave him Grace's name and a single instruction: find something. Anything. 3 days later, Alexander called Grace into his study. His face was impassive, but his eyes were turbulent. I need to ask you something, he began. Grace stiffened. Okay, is there anything? Anything in your past I should know about? Anything you've hidden? Grace's stomach dropped. I told you everything that mattered, she said slowly. I've never lied to you, Alexander. Victoria said Victoria doesn't know me. Grace interrupted, her voice sharp. And if you're taking her word over mine, then maybe I don't belong here. Silence pressed between them like a vice. Alexander looked at her, conflicted. I just need the truth. You already have it, she said, trembling. She turned to leave, then paused. I didn't ask to be here. You offered help. And now, because someone planted a seed of doubt, I'm being put on trial. She left the study with Lucy in her arms. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She simply walked away. That night, her room was empty. Alexander sat alone in the solarium. The rain had returned, tracing rivulets down the glass above his head. The house felt hollow again. He tried reading. He tried working, but everywhere he looked, he saw ghosts: Lucy's crayons, Grace's folded scarves, the faint smell of the jasmine oil she used on her skin. Victoria returned, smug in her victory. She left. She did. Good, Victoria said, sipping her wine. Alexander stared at her. For the first time, her voice didn't comfort him. It grated. Her presence, once familiar, now felt invasive. He stood, walked past her, and didn't look back. That night, he made a decision. He contacted a private investigator, not Victoria's. Find Grace Winslow, he said. And this time, bring me the truth. Not the whispers of someone with an agenda. The report arrived 5 days later. It broke him. Grace's past wasn't dark because she was hiding something, it was dark because she had survived things that would have destroyed someone weaker: abandonment, betrayal, poverty, and single motherhood. She had protected Lucy through storms he couldn't even imagine. And through it all, she had remained dignified, kind, unshaken. Alexander sat in silence for a long time after reading the report. Then he stood, grabbed his coat, and told his driver to get the car. I'm going to find her. Rain followed Alexander as he traveled across the city, a storm mirroring the churning regret inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't heading toward a business meeting or high society function. He was chasing a woman he had wronged in it because she lied. But because he had failed to believe her truth when it mattered most. Grace and Lucy had moved to a modest part of town. A temporary stay arranged through a shelter-run program for displaced mothers. It took days for Alexander's investigator to track her down, and every hour apart gnawed at him like a slow poison. When he finally arrived, he sat in the car for a long moment. He wasn't used to seeking forgiveness. He was used to closing deals, not healing wounds. He climbed the creaky stairs and knocked on the apartment door. No answer. He knocked again. Softer this time. A minute passed before the door cracked open just enough to reveal Grace's cautious eyes. She didn't speak. No, I don't deserve to be standing here, Alexander said quietly, but I need to talk to you, please. Grace didn't open the door, but she didn't close it either. I read the report, he continued. Not Victoria's report, mine. The truth. The real truth. And I'm ashamed of how easily I doubted you. I let someone else's bitterness cloud what I knew about you. Grace's voice was calm but distant. And now that you've verified my trauma in a document, is it real enough for you? Alexander flinched. I never should have needed proof, he said. That's on me. All of it. She studied him. You asked me for honesty, Alexander, and I gave it to you without hesitation. You were the first person I let in after years of holding everyone at arm's length. Do you know how hard that was for me? I do now, he said. Grace, I came here not expecting forgiveness. I came to own my failure. But if you'll let me, I want to fix this, not because I pity you or feel guilty, but because I was wrong. And because I miss you. Grace didn't cry, but her expression cracked, just slightly. Then a soft voice from inside the apartment. Mommy, is it him? Lucy. Grace turned. Yes, sweetheart. Alexander stepped forward. Hi Lucy, I've missed you. Lucy peeked out and beamed. I missed you, too, Mr. Alex. That broke Grace. The tension fell from her shoulders like shattered glass. Come in, she said. They didn't go back to the mansion immediately. Grace insisted on taking things slowly, not for herself, but for Lucy. Alexander agreed. He began visiting them regularly, bringing groceries, coloring books, flowers, and sometimes just himself. They walked through nearby parks, fed ducks by the river, and watched old Disney movies late into the evening. Lucy began calling him Uncle Alex, and Alexander didn't correct her. He cherished it. One night, as Lucy slept on the couch wrapped in a blanket, Grace sat beside him with her knees tucked under her. You know, she said, I used to believe home was a place, but now I think it's more about the people you're safe with. Alexander looked at her. Do you feel safe with me now? Grace hesitated. I want to, she said. I do. I'll wait. He whispered. They didn't kiss, but something passed between them. A quiet promise. Victoria, meanwhile, had grown increasingly unsettled. Her calls to Alexander went unanswered. Her invitations were declined. She felt the power she once had over him slipping through her fingers. And then came the public news. Alexander had donated $2.5 million to a foundation supporting homeless mothers and domestic violence survivors. The press praised his shift toward philanthropy. Investors applauded the good PR. But Victoria saw it for what it was, a tribute to Grace. She confronted him at a charity gala 3 weeks later. I underestimated her, Victoria said, her voice calm but cold. She's not a passing distraction, she's a threat. She's not a threat, Alexander replied. She's the future. Victoria's smile vanished. You're making a mistake. No, I made the mistake when I listened to you instead of my own heart. Victoria leaned in. If you think the world will welcome her, think again. You and I both know how this society works. They'll dissect her past like vultures. Let them try, he said. Then he walked away. A month later, Alexander invited Grace and Lucy to lunch at a new restaurant downtown. It was quiet, beautiful, and filled with soft jazz. Midway through the meal, Alexander pulled out a velvet pouch. Grace raised an eyebrow. If that's a ring, I'm going to walk out of here. He laughed. It's not. She opened the pouch and found a house key. I bought a small place, he said. Outside the city. Quiet, lots of space. A garden for Lucy. No staff. No pressure. I thought, maybe we could start fresh, together. Grace stared at the key for a long moment. I can't just erase what happened, she said. I don't want you to, he replied. I want to build something new with you. Not as an apology, as a beginning. Lucy leaned in. Does the house have a pink room? Alexander grinned. It has to. Grace smiled, tears rising in her eyes. This time, she didn't hold them back. The house was modest but beautiful. A cozy, sunlit cottage with creaky wood floors, ivy along the front porch, and wildflowers growing at the fence line. Lucy ran barefoot through the grass. Grace tended herbs in the kitchen window. Alexander worked from the study but came out every hour to help cook, paint the hallway, or simply hold Grace while she sipped tea. They weren't perfect. Some days were harder than others. Grace still flinched at sudden loud noises. Alexander still struggled to open up about his past, but they chose each other. every single day, and sometimes, that's all love needs to grow. Autumn painted the countryside in golden hues. Crisp air carried the scent of damp leaves, and the new home Grace, Lucy, and Alexander shared was finally beginning to feel lived in. Not just a place, they were building something real, something lasting. Lucy's laughter had returned to full bloom, skipping through the halls like a melody. Grace's eyes no longer held shadows of constant alertness, and Alexander had softened in ways he hadn't known he could. He was no longer just a businessman, he was present, tender, learning to live with emotion rather than against it. But life, as always, had one final test in store. One evening, while Alexander was in London for a business conference, Grace received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside were 2 old photographs and a single sentence, typed on expensive cardstock. Do you know who he is? The photos were grainy, clearly taken years ago, but unmistakable. Alexander, much younger, laughing beside a man Grace instantly recognized from news articles and whispers in tabloids. Vincent Mercer. A disgraced billionaire convicted of laundering charity funds and tied to illegal business operations across 3 continents. And next to them, barely visible, a woman with striking red hair, Victoria. Grace's hands trembled. The photographs weren't doctored. She turned the card over. No more clues. Her heart pounded. She didn't want to believe the worst, but memories surged. The way Alexander avoided discussing his past. The unease in his eyes whenever the name, Vincent Mercer, surfaced on the news. Victoria's warning at the gala. The world will dissect her past. Maybe it wasn't just her past being hunted. When Alexander returned the next night, Grace met him on the porch. She had the photos laid out on a small table beneath the porch light. He stopped short. I wasn't going to open this chapter again, Grace said, voice calm but taut. But someone thinks I should. Alexander stared at the photographs. His expression didn't shift. He didn't deny. I know how this looks, he began. Grace folded her arms. Then tell me what it is. Alexander sighed and sat slowly on the porch step. Vincent was my father's closest friend. Practically raised me when my parents passed. I was young, naive, and looked up to him. I joined his investment firm right out of college. I didn't see the corruption until it was too late. He looked at her. When the house of cards fell, I had 2 choices, protect him or testify. You testified, Grace asked, not quite breathing. I did, and I was disowned by what little family I had left. Blacklisted from most firms. I rebuilt my fortune from scratch, no inheritance, no favors, just guilt. And silence. I never spoke of it because the shame was too heavy. And I was afraid that telling you would make you see me as tainted. Grace looked away. Her mind swam. But you judged me for my past, she whispered. I know, he said, pained. That's what makes it worse. I judged you for things you had no control over, while hiding things I chose to bury. The air between them was dense with years of unspoken truths. I should have told you, he said, but you have every right to walk away now. If trust can't exist in both directions, it can't exist at all. Grace stood silently. Inside the house, Lucy hummed as she played with her dolls. She remembered her secrets, her scars, the way Alexander had eventually chosen her, not out of guilt, but out of love. She also remembered that broken people don't need to be perfect. They just need to choose each other. Again and again. I'm not walking away, she said softly. Alexander's eyes flickered. But if this family is going to survive, she added, we don't get to bury the hard things anymore. We face them together. He nodded slowly, his voice cracking. Together. Weeks passed, and the past no longer hovered like a ghost. It was a chapter they kept on the shelf but didn't deny. They chose openness, honesty. Then one evening, a fire broke out at the warehouse owned by Alexander's company. Arson. Investigators found signs of sabotage and a clear motive. Someone wanted revenge. Grace didn't need to guess who. Victoria. She was never seen near the warehouse, but she had power, and connections, and rage. Alexander wanted to retaliate legally. Grace urged him to let it go. She's already lost the one thing she valued, her approval, Grace said. Fighting her only feeds the fire. Instead, they shifted focus. They launched a foundation in Lucy's name, the Winslow Home Project, offering emergency housing and education for single mothers in crisis. The media praised their initiative. Investors returned with confidence, and Victoria's influence faded. Her final attempt to destroy them had only made their union stronger. It was Lucy's 6th birthday. Balloons swayed gently in the breeze. The garden was filled with flowers, cupcakes, and laughter. Neighbors came. Staff from the foundation came. Even Alexander's stoic old chauffeur shed a tear watching Lucy blow out her candles. Grace leaned against the archway of the garden as Alexander approached, wrapping an arm around her waist. "She asked me a question this morning," he said with a crooked smile. "Oh, she asked why people have to go through hard things to get to happy things." Grace smiled, eyes soft. "And what did you say?" "I told her that maybe happiness is stronger when you've had to fight for it." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. "And do you believe that?" He looked at her, then at Lucy spinning barefoot through the garden. "I do now." That night, after the guests had left and the stars emerged across the dark velvet sky, Grace tucked Lucy into bed. The little girl looked up at her. "Mommy, am I safe now?" Grace paused. She looked around the room, pink curtains fluttering slightly, books lined neatly on shelves. A framed picture of the three of them at the park. She kissed Lucy's forehead, double quotes, "Yes, baby, you're safe. We all are." Downstairs, Alexander waited by the fire, a mug in each hand. Grace joined him, resting her head on his chest. The fire crackled, the house humming with life. No more ghosts, no more fear. Just the quiet certainty of love earned and not inherited or bought, but built one honest moment at a time. And in that warmth, they knew the past would always be a part of them, but it would never again define them.